Bill C-8. C-8, as we have already said at this House this afternoon, is almost the same as C-26, but there are enhancements. Unlike C-26, which was missing, which did not get approval before prorogation.
To have a cybersecurity framework for this country, to protect Canadians, to be prepared for the numerous ways in which we need a proper framework for cybersecurity. C-8 is an improvement over C-26. There is more transparency, there have been improvements made, and there's more clarity around the question of what is essential infrastructure for Canadians in this area. But it does, of course, it's an omnibus bill, C-8. It creates an entirely new act, the Critical Cyber Systems Protection Act. It amends many other acts. And as much as we can stand here and say it's an improvement, it's also an improvement because at least some of the amendments that were made in clause by clause in committee, amendments primarily from the Conservative Party members of committee, improved the legislation and did more to protect privacy for Canadians. But there's largely still, despite some improvements which we welcome, I'm voting against C-8 because there are still too many loopholes and too many flaws. And it really is the case that I hope that when this bill, because I'm quite certain of its passage, and we do need legislation in this area, but not this, we're not ready yet. I very much hope that the Senate of Canada, in exercising sober second thought, will look at the debates here today and consider the briefs that were presented to the Public Safety Committee from the Canadian Civil Liberties Union, from the Citizen Lab, which is part of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, from Open Media, from a number of other concerned, technically expert groups who, while looking at cybersecurity, think this bill still has flaws that create constitutional weaknesses and fail to properly protect encryption and security of private information. The concerns fall into a couple of broad categories. And again, when the Senate of Canada looks at this, please consider, will this legislation be good enough to pass the tests? And this is an interesting area, cybersecurity, where Canada, in passing legislation, has an eye on what does the UK threshold test look like for protection of personal information before our products can be used within the UK. Certainly a number of experts have looked at this and think that C-8 doesn't get us across the threshold for what privacy protections are required in other countries. In general, despite improvements in transparency, the reality is that this law, C-8, like other laws passed recently, gives individual ministers too much power. We don't have the requirement for warrants. There's not enough judicial oversight. We still have a situation where many of these orders can be made without the public knowing. The notion that the minister alone decides that whether they can order a telecommunications company to pull access to their system to an individual Canadian who will not necessarily know this is happening, not have an opportunity to speak to it. The ongoing question of not only does this bill have loopholes, but it weakens existing protections that exist under other laws. And those points have been made well. I wanted to point out that I was going to particularly point to the brief of Open Media on C-8, pointing out that the bad loophole, I will quote, "A bad loophole you pass in this legislation does not just weaken this law, it will prove far more important than the law's intended purposes because there are serious loopholes that must be fixed, and they haven't been fixed." I certainly hope that the Senate will look at the Bloc Québécois amendment and of making sure that there's mandatory review of how this law is working within a confined and defined period of time.
In conclusion, Madam Speaker, it is clear that this bill is not perfect. No member here believes that this bill is sufficiently improved to be absolutely perfect.
Let's hope the Senate fixes the flaws and the bill comes back to us and the government accepts those fixes. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions?